Hello friends, think I've found a better microphone than the one I used when I made that Mingler video. This video covers the basic understanding and handling of the rack extension MidiTapper for propeller reason. I will include some demonstration examples to actually show what I'm talking about, and at the end you will have your own very first combinator patch including the MidiTapper. More patches should be available for download from the Hammer Prolog page. To start with, I'd better repeat some of the information from the MidiTapper product page at the Propeller shop. Repetition never hurts. On the contrary, it's your guide light on the way. Ready? Let's go. MidiTapper lets you control buttons and knobs of your recent devices by using the keys of any MIDI keyboard. You decide which MIDI key you want to control which buttons and knobs of your setup. You route it from MidiTapper to the CV inputs of your devices, and that's it. You're now ready to play your effects from your keyboard. Let me give you a few hints on the usefulness of this basic function. Wherever there is a CV modulation socket for a parameter of a device, MidiTapper can help you control that parameter. You can use it as a simple button, which at times is exactly what you need. Push the top button on the device panel to switch to a different amount of distortion, volume, filter and so on. Split the control signal and apply to several parameters pushing that one button. Release the button and all the settings return to where they were before. Now, regarding the real feature of MidiTapper, when you play, the closest control buttons to your fingers are the keys on your MIDI keyboard, and the keyboard usually automatically follows you when you change instrument, channel or track. With MidiTapper, you can choose any MIDI key you like. Okay, in all honesty, this basic function can also be achieved by using features of a few recent devices like Thor. MidiTapper, however, is a dedicated device for this and has a lot of additional features and a more functional graphical user interface to simplify the use of MIDI keys to control your rack extension devices. Let me continue now on how MidiTapper offers much flexibility and loads of different CV outputs. You can use the same MIDI key for 3 different switches by pressing, tapping or double tapping. 3 buttons in one key. You trigger these 3 switches in a similar way as you handle your computer mouse buttons. To begin with, you can click and hold to drag something on the computer, etc. We call this to press. Secondly, you can click once on a MIDI keyboard, we say tap, and we label it one tap. And finally, on the mouse you can double click. On the keyboard you double tap, and we label this 2 tap. The importance of this is to leave as many keys as possible for you to play notes from, right? For each of the 3 switches, that's the press, tap and double tap, you have 2 output shapes. One is a pulse output with attack, decay, sustain, hold and release envelope, and the other is a static output with just the attack and release slopes. Static in this case indicates that you decide when the switch should toggle back. One more major feature is that you have 3 separate groups of output levels, that's the on and off levels, applied to all these outputs. Normally these would be 0 and 1, or the opposite, but we'll come back to the use of these. By making all the settings of levels and times for these CV output signals controllable by CV modulation as well as knobs, you get a so much more flexible device. I will not be able to show you all you can do, but have to trust your fantasy. Let's quickly repeat the basic features of MidiTapper. I told you repetition is a good thing. The basic goal with MidiTapper is to enable you to control any knobs and buttons in your rack from your ordinary MIDI keyboard. You can use each keyboard key for 3 different switches: press, tap and double tap. Each switch has 2 different output shapes, an envelope pulse and a toggled level. There are 3 groups of output levels, that is, the on and off levels. 3 switches, 2 shapes, 3 level groups. That's 3 by 2 by 3 equaling 18 different outputs from the same MIDI key. By the way, there are also 3 copies of each of those sockets for your convenience. Before we go deeper into details, I'd also just like to mention a few additional features of the MidiTapper rack extension. There's a Learn button for selecting the key you want to use, the tap key. There is Sequence a CV input in parallel with MIDI, also reacting to the tap key. There is Sequence a CV through output, mingling the sequence input with the MIDI input. With a button, you can include or exclude the tap key in the outgoing Sequence a CV. On the back panel there are color-coded modulation input sockets for everything. In the front there are color-coded cable indicators showing you which sockets are used. All over the front you have plenty of meters and lamps for indication of signal statuses. Now then, we're ready to go through this device in kind of design idea order so you can follow the reasoning behind all added features. On the way we will stop now and then to build the demonstration combinator setup and try it out. Developing a rack extension, you must choose for the device to be an instrument, an effect or a utility. Well, MidiTapper I should say is a utility, since there's no sound output, only CV. Unfortunately, there is a functionality inherent in the device type, so if we set MidiTapper to be a utility, it would not receive MIDI input by default. This would force you to insert your MidiTapper into a combinator and manually configure it to receive MIDI input. Better than to make it an instrument so that it defaults to receiving MIDI. This is the reason you need to look in your list of instruments to find MidiTapper when you add it. The original ambition was to enable just this, to create a switch so that sound effects etc. can be controlled from the MIDI keyboard, hence the name MidiTapper. And the first implemented function was to simply listen to MIDI notes and react to one specific triggering note, the tap key. Tap key pressed turns the switch on, tap key released turns the switch off. 0 to 1 and back to 0. Easy as that. We have to have a straightforward yet simple way of specifying this tap key among the 128 to choose from. Well, one simple way is to have one knob for the octave and one for the note within the octave. There are several other ways, but knobs are the real stuff and can be controlled by CV in a natural way, so we chose knobs. This first design is still available in the released device. The 2 key selection knobs are there and a tap out socket. Now we move over to number 1 of the MidiTapper examples. With all these examples, please refer to the pictures in the examples document. Required setup for the MidiTapper examples. A simple combinator with an NN19 connected to output through a Scream 4. In turn directly connected to the combinator from devices. Go to menu, create instruments, NN19. Use the default setup or change the sound, for instance to organ 4. Go to menu, edit, combine, then select the NN19 again. Go to menu, create, creative effects, Scream 4 distortion, use the default setup, except the knobs for damage control and P1 are both set to 0. Go to the combinator programmer window, select NN19 and change it to receive notes only from D3 and upwards. to set the tap key silent. Example 1. Adding distortion by pressing a MIDI keyboard key. Existing setup. Basic setting as described in the previous section. Objective. Press key C3 to increase the distortion. Damage control on screenfall. Add a MidiTapper with a default patch. Connect MidiTapper tap output socket to screen damage control modulation socket. Try it. There should be a definite difference when C3 is pressed while you play. Now that was really easy, wasn't it? Eager to go on with the combinator maybe? Yes, we'll soon do. But first we need to get some more understanding of this fun little creature of a device. The first improvement idea to MidiTapper was to control more than one switch from the same trigger key. The idea comes from the computer mouse, where you're used to 3 button operations: click and hold, click and double click. MidiTapper has the same, but on your keyboard you don't click, you tap. Oh no objections. Amo designed the device, Amo says you tap. So the following function was implemented. The MidiTapper has 3 parallel switches activated by the same key, and we call them press, 1 tap and 2 tap. We all have different speed in our fingers, and there is obviously a need to adjust the time limit for a user tap as opposed to a user doing press and hold followed by a release. There is also an important time trade-off or compromise in this. Let me explain what I mean. When you want to trigger off a 2 tap like a double click, you do not want to affect the press and the 1 tap switches. The status of each switch must be independent of the others, if we should have 3 independent switches. The solution to separate the switches is to wait with the decision until the tap input times out, just like with mouse clicks. This in turn leads to a noticeable delay for the triggering of the press switch. You can set the timeout to 0.0 seconds to make press switching immediate, but then you will not at all be able to trigger the 1 tap and 2 tap switches. Could maybe be useful in some special cases. This timeout setting is controlled with a tap time knob, and the default time is 0.015 seconds. So, let me just make a quick repetition of what parts of the MidiTapper design we have looked at so far. We have a switch which can be controlled from a tap key on your MIDI keyboard. For this we included 2 knobs to select the tap key octave and the note within the octave. Next we extended the device to handle 3 switches handled by that same tap key. These are the press, 1 tap and 2 tap switches. To be able to separately handle these 3 switches, we have a timer which separates key press from key tap. Short button taps affect the 1 tap or 2 tap switch, while a long time push of the button or MIDI tap key will affect the press switch. The tap timer is set by a knob in the tap section of the panel. And now's the time to look at the second MidiTapper example. Example 2. Toggle distortion on and off by tapping. Existing setup as after example 1. Objective: tap key C3 to toggle between low and high distortion. Connect the upper left socket of MidiTapper static section 1 tap to screen damage control modulation socket. Try it. Tap quickly, faster than 0.15 seconds. The distortion should be turned on/off with each tap. Watch how the lamps change on the front. Use the time knob of the tap section to feel how the required time between taps changes. Also notice how the toggling of the switch is delayed with longer tap times. Set the time knob to a relaxed setting for you to tap, or use Control-click to return to the default time. We're now leaving the combinator again to move on with learning more features about MidiTapper. First time I connected an output from the MidiTapper to another device, I needed to adjust the socket trim knob of that device, but I wanted that on a front knob, automatable and maybe even with its own modulation socket. Oh, I could have used the separate device between. After all, I had the hammer measure device at hand. But this is not user-friendly. When the user needs something almost every time, it should be included in the device. 0 and 1 on the outputs simply isn't enough. But the on level needs to be adjustable by a knob on the front panel. Thinking just a second more, why only one? The on level. MidiTapper now has this solution. You choose both the levels. Having the switch on or off are simply two different states, and you separately choose what CV level should be output for each of them. There's an off level knob and an on level knob. By simply setting the off level to 1 and on to 0, you have the inverted output. We will often need both normal and inverted outputs at the same time though, so there must be 2 sets of output levels, and while we're at it, why not 3? This will really increase the flexibility to adjust different levels depending on how they will be used. We call these 3 output level groups, and they have 3 out sockets each for each switch. Press 1 tap and 2 tap, because you always need more sockets when you get creative. 3 groups, each with its own 2 levels on and off, gives 6 knobs for the output levels. Done. Okay, time for example number 3. Example 3. Adjusting the audio level when distortion is on. Existing setup as after example 2. Objective: make the audio level from the N and 19 similar between clean and distorted. Insert a mixer 14:2 between the scream outputs and the combinator from devices by connecting scream out to mixer input 1 and master out of the mixer to the combinator. Connect the leftmost group 2 mid-row red line socket of MidiTapper static section 1 tap to the level CV in of the mixer input 1. Pull down the mixer phase input 1 to 0 and set on level of the MidiTapper group 2 to 0.12. Try it. The distorted level should now be similar to the clean level, only sound is different. Now you know how to use the level knobs for the outputs. Maybe you also realize that you can change how much distortion you get by changing the on level of group 1, which is connected to the damage control of the scream device. Just the functionality we wanted. Let's go on now with learning about the next idea that we built into the MidiTapper. The distinct immediate switching between the on and off levels we presented so far can be useful sometimes. More often, however, you'd want to have smooth transitions giving a gradual change, or at least avoid clicks from the switch itself. The transition times really should be controllable too. Attack and release transition times for the outputs to go between the off and the on levels were included, and they are defined by 2 more knobs, A and R. The times available are the same for all time knobs in MidiTapper, 25 fixed values from 0 seconds up to about 12 seconds. The A and R knobs reside in the static section to separate them from the next feature, which is the trig pulse output. A short pulse to be used for triggering activities would be useful to start sequences, effect burst, etc. A beta tester expressed the idea to include an envelope shaper to these pulses, making it even more useful on its own rather than relying on external CV units. So, the envelope outputs were introduced, with knobs for attack and decay times, sustain level, hold and release times labeled A, D, S, H and R. This is the design stage where we realized that the MidiTapper size had to grow from 1 unit height to 2 units. The times are again 25 steps between 0 and 12 seconds, while the sustain level is specified as a percentage of the distance between the off and on levels. There is a special feature detail that I need to mention regarding the envelope. If you turn the envelope attack knob full left to 0, the output will never go to the on level but move directly from off level to the sustain level. The time used for this will be the decay time. This reduces the risk of unwanted clicks, but you can still get a punch envelope by setting the attack to next time step at 0.01 seconds. This is only 1/100th of a second and not audible. We'll soon go on to the examples again, but first, you guessed, summary and repetition. Since earlier we have a switch to toggle between 2 output levels, and the ability to control this switch from the tap key on your MIDI keyboard. We expanded this to press 1 tap and 2 tap as separate switches from the same tap key, and for this to work, an adjustable tap timer to separate between pressing and tapping. Our latest additions were 2 different output shapes handled in separate panel sections, namely the static outputs, which are toggled on and off from the tap key, and which have attack and release times as set by the A and R knobs. The envelope outputs, which are generated as pulses of defined length given by the sum of the attack, decay, hold and release times. These times are set by the A, D, H and R knobs. The sustain level during the hold time is set by the S knob. Hey, we're gaining speed, right? We now go for examples 4 and 5. Example 4. Adding a distortion variation by pressing the tap key. Existing setup as after example 3. Objective: change the distortion by pressing the tap key C3 on the keyboard. Add a cable from static press section, group 1, top row, for instance leftmost socket, and connect this to the P1 modulation socket of the Scream device. Try it. While playing notes, press and hold the tap key C3 to hear it. Example 5. Using the envelope for more variation, pressing the tab key. Existing setup as after example 4. Objective: add a pitch effect when pressing the tab key. Add a cable from envelope press section, group 3 bottom row, for instance leftmost socket, and connect this to the NN19 oscillator pitch input. Change group 3 levels to 0 for off and 1 for on. Change the sustain knob of the envelope section to 15%. Try it. While playing notes, press and hold the tap key C3 to hear it. Turn the knobs of the envelope section until you find something nice, for instance as in the picture. Try also, while pressing the tap key, switch the heavier distortion on or off by quickly releasing the tap key and pressing again. This is what we call inverted tapping. Quite amusing effect, inspiring even, right? And all handled by that one tap key on your keyboard. Ready to move on to the next added MidiTapper feature? While the basic idea of MidiTapper was to use the MIDI inputs for triggering switches, this device now offers so much more. It would be reasonable to expect to be able to trigger it with other sources too, wouldn't it? A button on the panel must be included, so you can really click and double click with your mouse for testing your tap timer and setup if nothing else. And with a modulation socket for this button, you have even more options. This is a CV utility, so why can it not be controlled by sequence and note and gate CV? This was included too. Time for a repetition again. Nah, just kidding, but it's time to do example 6 of the MidiTapper examples document. Example 6. Using sequencer CV input and output. Existing setup as after example 5. Objective: trig MidiTapper from both MIDI and from sequencer CV. Add a matrix and set it up to play notes above G#3, but the final note set to tap key C3. Connect matrix note and gate outputs to MidiTapper sequencer CV note and gate outputs. Connect MidiTapper sequencer CV note and gate outputs to NN19 sequencer inputs. Run the matrix. With the matrix resolution at 1/8 and faster, you should get a 1-tap trig for every C3 in the pattern. With resolution at 1/4 and slower, you should instead get a press trig. Play your keyboard. You should still be able to trig the MidiTapper by MIDI. Pretty cool, eh? We're now entering the final design steps of this MidiTapper evolution biography. Seeing that this device may be most useful in a live situation, there should be a quicker and more intuitive way to set the trigger key, the MIDI tap key. The tap key learn button was added. Push the learn button, press your MIDI key, release the learn button, done. Tap key is selected. Now that we have note and gate in, and we don't want the MidiTapper to be a black hole, so the through output sockets are added. Most of the time, you don't want the trigger key to actually produce any note on the instrument used. What to do? Let me first establish that MIDI inputs going directly to other devices are out of reach for the MidiTapper. Possible solutions are all outside this device, and here are a few tips. Limit the MIDI receive range for the instrument and keep the trigger keys to the end of your MIDI keyboard, like we do in the examples. Remember to split the keyboard, or remember to use the learn button if you transpose the keyboard. Another solution could be to add a small low-budget MIDI keyboard for trigger keys only and set it to an octave far below or above any keys you normally use. The sequencer outputs of MidiTapper, on the other hand, are absolutely under our control, so we can simply block the trigger key from being transferred to the through note and gate outputs. We implemented this, and to maintain flexibility, a button was added, so you can choose to let the trigger key through in case you want to. Actually, this way you can create a setup where you generate different sounds and apply different effects for each note by plenty of MidiTappers. That's the charm of rack extensions. You only pay for the first one, right? Now moving on to the final example 7. Example 7. Using sequencer CV input and output more. Existing setup as after example 6. Objective: use all MIDI keyboard with or without including sound from the tap key. Change in the combinator programmer so that NN19 will not receive MIDI notes. You should hear no difference to the matrix notes playing and triggering effects. Play notes and tap the tap key on your MIDI keyboard. You should still be able to trigger the MidiTapper by MIDI, and now all notes except the tap key, still C3, are playable with sound. Notice the common feature of all sequencer chords or legato notes. All played notes will hang until all gates are released. MIDI gate off will now release matrix legatos. Push the learn button and release randomly. Notice how MidiTapper is triggered by a different key and how that affects the loop totally. Maybe you now have the matrix triggering both press and one tap, depending on the length of the tap keys and the matrix resolution. At very high tempo, maybe even 2 tap will be triggered by 2 tap keys in a row somewhere. Try out the key through button, combined with different tap keys. This is the last example, so now's the time to set your creativity free. That 2 tap output could maybe be connected to a modulation input of the MidiTapper. Or something else on the NN90, or maybe add a pulse or random signal to the modulation. That's the end of this tutorial, folks. The examples should be available in the document, as well as a combinator patch for downloading, and maybe a song somewhere, and maybe more combinator patches, but most of all, your own fantasy. Have a nice time.